A voice sliced through the first-class cabin like a knife. "Sorry, sir, there's been a mistake. We need you to give up your seat." In that instant, the crowded space froze. Seat 2A, where David Carter sat, became the center of the entire cabin. In front of him, flight attendant Laura Bennett wore a strained smile, one that could not hide the tension in her eyes. Behind her, a white woman in a glittering dress, Catherine Doyle, tapped her gold watch against her wrist as if the entire world were moving too slowly for her. "I always sit here," Catherine declared, loud enough for everyone to hear. David looked up, his eyes reflecting confusion. He produced his platinum membership card, along with a clearly printed boarding pass. Seat 2A, his name. Everything was in order. But Laura leaned closer, her voice sweet yet sharp as steel. "This seat is usually reserved for more special guests." The words landed like an invisible slap. Murmurs spread through the cabin. A few passengers raised their phones, ready to record. The air grew stifling, not just because of a seat dispute, but because the unspoken message was all too clear. A black man did not belong there. David's fingers gripped the edge of his seat. He had heard that tone all his life, in classrooms, in boardrooms, and now at 30,000 feet. He steadied his voice. "I am a platinum member. This is my assigned seat." Laura's smile stayed fixed, but her eyes flicked toward Catherine, as though seeking approval. Catherine tilted her head ever so slightly, flashing a smug grin. What neither of them knew was that the man they were trying to push out was not just any passenger. David Carter, 40, 5 years old, was the founder of Carter Innovations, an artificial intelligence empire worth $3.5 billion. He also held 27% of the shares in Atlantic Airways, the very airline they worked for. In just a few minutes, their mistake would shake the entire company. David remained still, but inside, memories surged. He saw himself at 15, standing at his father's graveside after a factory accident. Cold rain had soaked him, but a fire ignited in his chest, a vow to create technology that ensured people would be judged fairly, regardless of skin color or background, from an old donated computer. He taught himself to code, working deep into the night while his friends slept. 30 years later, that vow had built an empire. Carter Innovation software helped Fortune 500 companies eliminate bias in hiring. And yet today, he himself was once again the target of blatant prejudice. In the cabin, passengers watched as if witnessing a play. A young businessman whispered, "He must have taken the wrong seat." Another shrugged, "Doesn't look like someone who can afford first class." Their murmurs cut sharper than any blade. David did not reply. He only observed, like a programmer scanning lines of faulty code for the truth. Laura retreated to the service counter, her eyes betraying unease. She had just received a triumphant nod from Catherine, accompanied by a discreet touch, a folded bill slipping into her uniform pocket. A quick move, but enough to shift the atmosphere. The dispute no longer looked like a misunderstanding. It was bribery, unfolding in front of everyone. David saw it clearly. And in that moment, he understood. This was not about a seat. It was a test, for him, for the airline, and for the values he had dedicated his life to defending. The whispers grew louder. Catherine even raised her voice deliberately. "I have a charity gala tonight. I need my usual seat. This is mine." Meanwhile, several passengers' phones glowed, recording every moment. They did not know what power the silent man held, but they knew one thing. This scene would spread. David met Laura's eyes as she returned. His voice was firm, steady, without a tremor. "No, I chose this seat for the space to work, and I will remain here." At that moment, a faint smile appeared on his lips, not of provocation, but of someone who knew he was about to rewrite the script everyone else believed they were watching. To the cabin, David looked like a stubborn passenger. But the truth was different. He was a man who could topple the entire system with a single phone call. And in silence, he was preparing to do just that. The play of injustice had only just begun. The first-class cabin was turning into a stage. Passengers whispered, phones discreetly recorded. But in David Carter's mind, every detail was being stored as evidence. Flight attendant Laura Bennett returned, her face tense. She tried to maintain a professional smile, but her eyes darted away, avoiding David's. Beside her stood Thomas Reed, the first-class supervisor, tall with his chin lifted arrogantly. He stepped forward like a judge, his voice firm. "Sir, we need you to move so this seat can be given to our VIP guest." The entire cabin held its breath. This was no longer a request. It was an order. David raised his head, his voice slow but steady. "I have already presented my platinum membership card and valid ticket. This is my assigned seat. I see no reason to leave." The words "assigned seat" landed like a marker driven into the ground. Some passengers nodded in agreement, but Catherine Doyle, standing tall behind, scoffed with folded arms. "He doesn't understand what it means to be worthy." The remark ignited the air like a spark in dry powder. Thomas stepped closer, his shadow falling across David. His voice dropped, sugar, coated but laced with threat. "There are two ways, sir. The easy way and the hard way. You choose." The cabin fell silent. Even the roar of the engines seemed distant. All eyes fixed on David, waiting to see if he would yield or erupt. But David chose neither. He stared directly at Thomas, his eyes cold and sharp. "I am not moving." 7 simple words, no shouting, no trembling. Yet the space seemed to shudder. Thomas flushed red, his jaw tightening. He spun around and stormed towards the front of the cabin. A ripple of murmurs spread through the passengers. Phones lifted higher, whispers circled, and Catherine's mask of patience began to crack. Moments later, the cockpit door opened. Captain William Harris emerged, his weathered face lined with tension. Beside him, Laura and Thomas flanked like a squad entering battle. They surrounded David, 3 standing, 1 seated. Authority weighed heavy. "Sir," Captain Harris began, his voice deep and deliberate, "the crew has the authority to reassign seating to ensure the comfort and convenience of all passengers. I ask you to cooperate and move to another seat." David looked up at the 3 of them, his breathing steady, his voice calm but resolute. Captain, I respect your authority to command this flight. But I have a valid ticket, a platinum membership, and I chose this seat because I need the space to work. There is no policy requiring me to surrender it to another passenger simply because they want it. The word want cut through the air like a blade. Some passengers chuckled softly, others nodded in approval. But Catherine's eyes flared wide. This is the most ridiculous thing I have ever seen. I have a gala tonight. This is my seat. Captain Harris frowned, glancing at Thomas. He could feel the situation slipping beyond control. But Thomas cut in, his voice cold. If you continue to refuse, we will have no choice but to remove you from this flight. A direct threat. David arched an eyebrow, surprise flickering for the first time. He answered slowly, each word deliberate. You're telling me I will be removed from this plane because I refuse to give up the seat I lawfully purchased? The cabin erupted in murmurs. A businessman muttered, "That makes no sense." A young woman near the back wiped away tears. The passengers split in silence, some quietly supportive, others complicit. Catherine suddenly cried out, dramatic as if on stage. "I have never been treated so poorly. He can't even afford to sit in first class." The words landed like a public lash. David did not respond. Instead, he calmly took out his phone, opened the camera, and pressed record. His voice was clear and composed. "I want to be very clear. I am being threatened with removal from this flight solely because I refuse to surrender the seat assigned to me to another passenger." Thomas jolted, his eyes blazing. He lunged, hand outstretched to snatch the phone, his voice sharp. "Filming is forbidden on this aircraft." David pulled the phone back, his tone low but sharp. "There is no federal law prohibiting recording unless it interferes with crew duties. I am simply protecting myself." The cabin buzzed with voices. Some passengers clapped softly. Thomas froze, furious but helpless. Then came the heavy thud of footsteps down the aisle. 2 airport security officers entered, their eyes cold. The air froze. One spoke. "Sir, we've been instructed to remove you from this flight. Please gather your belongings." At that moment, David remained seated, his back straight, his gaze steady. He knew, from here on, the truth would not remain confined to first class. It would erupt, spread beyond the skies, and drag the entire airline down with it. And this was only the beginning. The thud of security boots against the carpet made the air in the cabin feel suffocating. Every eye turned toward the aisle, some eager, some shocked, some lowered in shame. 2 security officers stopped at seat 2A, their voices firm. "Sir, please collect your belongings and come with us." In that moment, time seemed to slow. David Carter remained seated, back straight, his gaze calm. His heart beat slow but powerful, like the drum of a suspenseful score. He did not shout or resist. He simply looked at them and asked, his voice clear and deliberate. "Tell me, exactly what policy of the airline have I violated?" The officers hesitated. The question echoed through the cabin, exposing the absurdity of the situation. They exchanged uneasy glances before one replied, his voice quieter. "We were only told you were being disruptive." A ripple of whispers spread through the passengers. Several leaned forward, phones held higher, capturing every second. David drew a deep, slow breath. He knew he was losing on this small stage, but the larger game was only beginning. He set his stylus on the tray table, folded away his tablet and documents with solemn precision. Rising to his feet, his voice was steady but resonant. "I am being forced off this plane solely because I refused to surrender my rightful seat to another passenger. Everyone here is a witness." Seats creaked. An elderly man in 2B shook his head in disappointment. A young woman near the back wiped away tears. Meanwhile, Catherine Doyle leaned back smugly, a satisfied smile curling her lips. David followed the officers down the aisle. Each step he took echoed like a judge's gavel in a courtroom. Though he was being removed, his head remained high. As he passed Thomas Reed, the cabin supervisor, an unexpected moment unfolded. Catherine, believing no one noticed, discreetly slipped another wad of cash into Thomas's pocket and whispered, "Thank you for handling the situation." But this time, phones were still recording. At least 3 cameras caught it all. A passenger whispered, "My God, they're bribing him right in front of us." The cabin door opened. David stepped off the plane under escort. The sky outside was brilliantly clear, but inside him a storm raged. He pulled out his phone, his fingers flying over the screen. The message he sent was brief, but powerful enough to ignite a firestorm. "Gather the legal team immediately. I have just been removed from an Atlantic Airways flight on grounds of discrimination." He had not yet left the terminal when a shaky voice called out, "Wait, please wait." David turned. A young woman, slight, hair hastily tied back, ran towards him with her phone in hand. Her eyes were red, but her gaze burned with resolve. "I recorded everything," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "From the moment the first flight attendant approached you, to when they forced you off, and even when she slipped him the money." She held out her phone. The video was crystal clear, every word audible. The entire truth fit in the palm of her hand. David looked at her, his expression softening. He nodded, his voice low but resolute. "Thank you. You've just given me the weapon they never expected." Meanwhile, back on the plane, Catherine lifted a glass of champagne Laura had just handed her, reveling as if she had won a grand victory. Thomas sat hidden in the galley, secretly counting the bills. Laura lowered her head, avoiding the stares of her colleagues. None of them knew the video was already spreading across the internet like wildfire, and their careers had only hours left. Standing in the terminal, David inhaled deeply. The sting of humiliation still pressed against his chest, but beneath it burned a fierce determination. This was no longer his story alone. It was the story of millions who had been overlooked, dismissed, pushed aside from the places they rightfully belonged. He raised his phone and dialed Sarah Mitchell, Chief Operating Officer of Carter Innovations. "Sarah, prepare an emergency meeting. Within 24 hours, we won't just file a lawsuit. We will reset the standard for this entire airline industry." His voice carried through the terminal, solid and commanding. Passers-by turned instinctively, not knowing who he was, but sensing the weight behind his words. The story was far from over. It had only just begun, with evidence in hand, the world watching, and a CEO underestimated but powerful enough to upend an empire. The wheels of justice had begun to turn, and nothing could stop them now. The phone screen glowed in the darkness of the top-floor office at Atlantic Airways headquarters. On it, a video spread at lightning speed. The footage was sharp and undeniable. A flight attendant bowing her head while taking money. Supervisor Thomas Reed snarling threats. Catherine Doyle arrogantly declaring, "My seat." And finally, David Carter being escorted off the plane as passengers looked on in quiet outrage. CEO Patricia Morgan gripped the phone, her face pale. She had weathered crises before, but never had something exploded this fast or this fiercely. Outside her office door, hurried footsteps and ringing phones filled the air. The world was collapsing on Atlantic Airways, and she knew why. The name on the emergency report glared back at her. David Carter, the airline's largest shareholder and CEO of Carter Innovations. Patricia let the phone drop onto her desk, her thoughts reeling. My God, we just threw our own shareholder off a plane. Meanwhile, in a hotel near the airport, David sat in a small conference room with his lawyers and media advisors. On the big screen, the young woman's video played. Catherine's whispers, the crinkle of bills sliding into Thomas's pocket, David's steady voice. I will not move. One lawyer tapped the table firmly. This is gold. They have no defense left. David didn't respond immediately. He stared at the screen, each frame reflecting in his eyes. He didn't just see his own humiliation. He saw his father, fired without reason. He saw millions of faces cast aside by invisible prejudice. Finally, he spoke, his voice deep and deliberate. We won't just sue. We will force them to change. The next morning, the board of directors at Atlantic Airways convened in emergency session. The spacious room, normally reserved for strategic debates, now suffocated under the weight of fear. Directors, pulled in hastily in golf shirts and wrinkled suits, shifted nervously in leather chairs. The doors swung open. David Carter entered. He wore no power suit, only a plain shirt, yet the aura he carried silenced the entire room. Behind him trailed his lawyers and advisors. There was no need for introductions, no need for greetings. Everyone knew exactly who he was, and the catastrophic mistake they had made. Patricia Morgan shot to her feet. Mr. Carter, we sincerely apologize for... David raised a hand, cutting her off, his voice cold. I don't care about apologies. I care about accountability. The last word landed like a hammer. The big screen lit up again. The video played not on social media this time, but in the boardroom itself. Every word, every gesture sliced into the company's honor. When the scene of Catherine slipping cash to Thomas appeared, some directors lowered their heads, others sighed, a few visibly flinched. When the video ended, silence hung heavy. Only the hum of the air conditioner filled the void. David scanned the room, his gaze sharp. You've all seen it. This is not just discrimination. This is rot in your corporate culture. I have 3 demands. He raised 3 fingers, decisive. 1. Everyone involved is terminated immediately. 2. The $80 million contract you've been negotiating with Carter Innovations, I cancel it. 3. A full independent audit of Atlantic Airways culture and HR policies, made public. Whispers erupted. One director protested weakly. Mr. Carter, please reconsider. Suspension or warnings instead of termination. Perhaps we—" David cut in, his tone ironclad. "There is no negotiation. Either you act, or I sell every share I hold and let the market decide your fate." The boardroom door burst open. A financial officer rushed in, face drained of color. In his hands, a tablet displayed a blood-red chart. "Ladies and gentlemen, the stock has dropped 20% overnight. Analysts predict it could fall 40% if we don't act immediately." The room plunged into despair. Ties loosened. Trembling hands gripped water glasses. The harsh reality was clear. The life or death of Atlantic Airways now rested in the hands of the man they had once dismissed, the man they had forced out of seat 2A. David leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. He didn't need to shout, didn't need to threaten. Power now lay firmly in his silence. In another room of the building, Thomas Reed, Laura Bennett, and Captain Harris sat frozen in silence. They didn't yet know what awaited them, but the murmurs outside, the averted eyes of colleagues, all signaled the same truth. Their verdict had already been written. This was no longer a dispute over a seat on an airplane. It had become a revolution within an entire corporation. On the third floor of Atlantic Airways headquarters, the ticking of a clock filled the suffocating silence. 3 chairs stood side by side, occupied by Thomas Reed, Laura Bennett, and Captain William Harris. Their faces were tense, eyes fixed on the floor, like defendants awaiting judgment. The door swung open. Ellen Brooks, the Director of Human Resources, entered with 2 security officers and a company lawyer. She set her laptop on the table, her gaze cold, her voice blunt. "I will be direct. Your employment award is terminated immediately, effective now." A deadly silence followed. Laura gasped, covering her mouth. "This can't be. I was only following the passenger's request." Thomas shot to his feet, his face flushed red, voice choking with anger. "We followed procedure. Carter was the one being disruptive." Ellen pressed enter. The screen lit up with the video. Every detail played out. Catherine slipping cash into Thomas's pocket. Laura bowing her head in acceptance. Thomas issuing threats. The captain standing by in silence. Each frame cut through their excuses like a blade. Ellen's voice was ice. "This is the procedure you speak of. Bribery, discrimination, threatening a passenger." Captain Harris closed his eyes as if wishing to escape reality. Thomas froze. Laura broke into trembling sobs. But the verdict had already fallen, and there was no way back. The 2 security officers stepped forward. The scene flipped. Those who had once ordered a passenger thrown off a plane before dozens of witnesses were now themselves escorted out of company headquarters. Colleagues watched from the hallways, eyes filled with disdain, some discreetly filming on their phones. Thomas shouted, "You can't do this! I've given 10 years!" But his cry was swallowed by the slam of the glass door. Outside headquarters, the storm of public outrage surged. The original video spread across social media, shared millions of times within 12 hours. Hashtags, #justice for David and Seat 2A, shot straight to the top of global trends. A television journalist remarked, "This is not just about one passenger being discriminated against. It is a moment exposing the dark underbelly of the airline industry, where privilege and prejudice outweigh justice. Social media boiled with fury. One tweet was retweeted hundreds of thousands of times. He paid like everyone else, but because of his skin color, they decided he didn't belong. Shameful. Another video surfaced showing Catherine Doyle boasting at a gala that same evening, champagne glass in hand, bragging that she had reclaimed her seat. Instead of admiration, she became the target of ferocious criticism. In the hotel suite where David Carter was staying, the television played non-stop news of the incident. Major networks declared, "Atlantic Airways faces an unprecedented crisis." A media advisor turned to David, voice urgent. "Mr. Carter, the public is on your side. If you speak out now, the airline will collapse completely." David was silent for a few seconds. Then he spoke, his voice deep, slow, but carrying far. "I don't want the airline to collapse. I want it to change. The truth is not for revenge, but for reform." The room fell still. While the world demanded blood, David chose the harder path, the path of rebuilding. Meanwhile, at Atlantic headquarters, the board sat paralyzed before a screen drenched in red stock charts. Patricia Morgan leaned back in her chair, her hands trembling. She whispered, almost only to herself, "We are not facing a PR crisis. We are facing the collapse of trust." An older director across the table nodded heavily. "And trust cannot be bought with money." On the evening broadcasts, images of Thomas Reed, Laura Bennett, and Captain Harris being fired spread widely. A commentator closed the segment with a cold remark. "Yesterday, they thought they were the most powerful people on the plane. Today, they are nothing more than a living lesson in justice and consequence." But this was not the end. The storm had only just begun, and David Carter would turn his humiliation into the spark of a revolution. At dawn the next day, the entire world knew about the 2A incident. Major newspapers plastered the headlines across their front pages. "Billion-dollar tech CEO ejected from his rightful seat." Atlantic Airways faces accusations of discrimination. One bribe, one wrong decision, $1 billion price. Within just 24 hours, the video recorded by the young woman had surpassed 80 million views. Social media erupted. From New York to Nairobi, from Tokyo to London, people shared it with the hashtag Justice for David like a global banner. The financial markets responded without mercy. At the New York Stock Exchange, screens glowed red. Atlantic Airways shares plummeted. The number on the board read 32%. A financial analyst shook his head on live television. "This is not just a financial shock. This is a crisis of trust. Investors understand that if a company allows such a toxic culture to exist, then every profit report is meaningless." The biggest investment funds dumped their shares. Within 48 hours, Atlantic Airways lost $4.6 billion in market value. Inside the Atlanta headquarters, the boardroom lights stayed on all night. The board of directors sat around the long table, faces dark with despair. Piles of printed reports were worthless compared to a 90-second video. CEO Patricia Morgan buried her head in her hands, her voice hoarse. If we don't act now, Atlantic will not survive the next quarter. A finance director slid a tablet toward her with trembling hands. The stock chart plunged straight down. A small caption at the bottom chilled the room. Credit rating downgraded to BR. Risk of bankruptcy without a bailout. Outside, small protests began to appear. At Chicago Airport, passengers held up signs. No discrimination in the skies. In New York, dozens of former employees spoke out, recounting their experiences of being ignored, belittled, and abandoned. One former flight attendant broke down in tears on live television. We tried to warn them. The culture was toxic, but no one listened. In the hotel where David Carter was staying, the phone rang non-stop. News outlets, human rights groups, even federal lawmakers wanted to meet him. But David remained silent. He sat by the window, watching the stream of cars below. On the table lay stacks of legal documents prepared by his attorneys. One advisor asked nervously, "Mr. Carter, this is the chance to destroy them completely. Do you want to file the lawsuit now?" David looked up, his eyes clear but calm. "I don't want destruction. I want reform. If Atlantic collapses, tens of thousands of innocent employees will lose their jobs. But if they change, the entire industry will follow." The room fell silent. That was the difference between a man seeking revenge and a leader seeking justice. At the same time, inside Atlantic headquarters, a series of unprecedented decisions were made. The board approved a 90-day emergency reform plan. Terminate all staff involved in the 2A incident. Establish an independent commission on culture and equity, supervised by outside experts. Invite David Carter to serve as special advisor to oversee the reforms. When Patricia read the third item, the room erupted in protest. A director slammed the table. "You can't be serious. You want the victim himself to lead the reform of this company? That's—" But before he could finish, a new alert appeared on the big screen. The stock price had dropped another 8% in just 30 minutes. Every protest was instantly silenced. That afternoon, Patricia picked up the phone, her hands trembling as she dialed. On the other end, David's deep, steady voice answered. "This is Carter." "Mr. Carter?" Patricia inhaled deeply, then spoke with a voice choked with emotion. "Atlantic formally invites you to serve as special advisor to oversee our reform. We need you." There was a pause. Then David replied, each word landing like stone. "I will accept, but not to save Atlantic, to save the people you have forgotten." The news spread like wildfire. Headlines declared, "Man ejected from seat 2A, becomes reform advisor to Atlantic Airways." Social media exploded again, this time with messages of hope and encouragement. This isn't just justice. This is hope. That night, in the drizzle over Atlanta, the sign of Atlantic Airways headquarters still glowed brightly. But the real light was coming from somewhere else, lit by a man they had once humiliated in public, who now returned to change everything. And this reform had only just begun. The first days of the reform plan felt like a storm sweeping through Atlantic Airways. Hallways at headquarters were lined with hastily pinned posters. Respect, fairness, zero tolerance for discrimination. Meetings ran back to back. Employees summoned into conference rooms in groups. No one was exempt. In one large room, Fluorescent lights glared down on dozens of tense faces. On stage, an independent trainer, hand-picked by David Carter, played the now infamous video. Catherine Doyle slipping money, Thomas Reed taking it, David being escorted off the plane. The trainer's voice rang out. "This is not just a video on the internet. This is a lesson. It shows how one moment of unfairness can destroy an entire organization." The room was heavy with silence. Some employees lowered their heads, some clenched their fists, others sighed in frustration. David did not appear in the first training sessions, but his presence was felt everywhere. Thousands of customer emails were printed and pinned across bulletin boards. "I was once denied service because my skin didn't look like other passengers. The airline forgot that every ticket is paid for equally. We want to fly with an airline that treats us fairly, not one that selects passengers by skin color." The words were shaky, sometimes brief, sometimes spanning a full page. Each one a bitter reminder. In a small conference room on the 7th floor, senior executives sat across from David. He calmly opened his laptop and projected the 90-day culture reform plan. "My goal is not to save Atlantic," he said, his voice steady and deliberate. "My goal is to make this a place where anyone, from a student to a CEO, can board a plane without fear of being disrespected." A deputy director muttered under his breath. "We'll lose our loyal clients, people like Catherine Doyle." David turned, his eyes cold as steel. "Clients who rely on bribes and privilege are not assets. They are liabilities." The room fell into silence. On the 10th day of reform, a group of flight attendants gathered in the cafeteria. They whispered, "We're being treated like criminals. But if we don't change, the airline will die." A young flight attendant, Angela Kim, suddenly stood up. Her voice trembled at first, then grew stronger. "I've seen passengers discriminated against many times, but I stayed silent. That video made me ashamed. I want change. If David Carter had the courage to stand alone against an entire crew, then the least I can do is speak out." The air shifted. For the first time, the silence of complicity began to crack. The press did not take their eyes off Atlantic. Every step forward or misstep made the front page. One journalist wrote, "The world has never seen an airline forced to perform public surgery on its culture like this. This is no longer just a company. This is a test for an entire industry." Social media kept roaring. The hashtag #NewAtlantic spread widely, accompanied by comments. "We'll support them again if they truly change. Don't just put on a show. Prove it." One late evening, David sat alone in his temporary office at headquarters. City lights cast a glow across his weary but determined face. He opened a new email, a black passenger, describing how she had been ignored by flight attendants for an inter-flight, feeling invisible. At the end of the letter was a single line, "Thank you for speaking for us." David leaned back, taking a deep breath. That was why he was still here. Not for shares, not for reputation, but for the millions of voices that had never been heard. On day 30, Atlantic held a public dialogue with all employees worldwide, streamed live. Tens of thousands tuned in from across the globe. Patricia Morgan opened with a voice heavy with emotion. "We were wrong. We let prejudice stain our mission of service. And today, we must begin again." Then she handed the microphone to David. He stepped forward, his gaze sweeping across the hall. "I do not stand here as a shareholder or a CEO. I stand here as a passenger, as a human being. And I want to remind you, fairness is not a privilege. It is a basic right for everyone." Applause thundered, lasting several minutes. For the first time since the storm, Atlantic felt a new breeze. Fragile, but real. The reform had begun. But the question remained, would Atlantic have the courage to see it through? Or would it collapse halfway? A month later, Atlantic Airways seemed to have escaped the storm. But in truth, the storm had only shifted direction. The internal customer satisfaction dashboard glowed a furious red. Cancellations up 27% compared to the same period last year. Rival airlines seized the moment, rolling out ads that read, "Fly with us, where every passenger is respected." That indirect blow kept Atlantic's leadership sleepless at night. On Monday morning, the boardroom echoed with sharp voices. One sales director barked, "We cannot keep apologizing forever. Passengers are abandoning us. If we keep pouring energy into cultural reform, we'll bleed out financially before we ever succeed." Another executive shot back, "No, if we don't change, we'll die from the loss of trust, and that death will come even faster." Chairs scraped, tempers flared, the meeting devolved into shouting. Patricia Morgan sat in the middle, fists clenched, eyes locked on David Carter, silent since the beginning, but a silence strung as tight as a wire, ready to snap. Finally, David spoke. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the noise like a blade. "The true death will not come from losses or from lost trust. It will come from hesitation. The side we choose today will decide whether Atlantic lives or dies." But it wasn't only the board that was divided. Inside the workforce, two clear camps had formed. One, mostly younger flight attendants and new hires, threw themselves into the training sessions. They posted their stories on social media with the hashtag #NewAtlantic, expressing hope for a fairer environment. The other whispered in the shadows of hallways, "They're making us the villains. They want to erase all our traditions just to please the public." Some veteran flight attendants flatly rejected the reform program, dismissing the anti-bias training as nothing more than theater. At a training session in Houston, tensions erupted. The trainer replayed the infamous video, his voice stern. "One discriminatory act made billions vanish. Do you understand the power of justice and trust?" Richard Hale, a long-serving attendant, shot up, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Justice? This is just one angry billionaire. If he wasn't Carter, would we even be suffering through this so-called reform?" The room froze. Many stared down at the floor. But Angela Kim, the young attendant who had once stood up in the cafeteria, could not hold back this time. He may be a billionaire, but what happened to him has happened to thousands of other passengers. The only difference is no one recorded it. He spoke for all of them. Two gazes collided, one of defiance, one of conviction. The air was tight as a drawn bowstring. Outside, public opinion deepened the divide. International media praised David Carter as a symbol of change. But tabloids struck back with poisonous headlines. "Atlantic's reform is just a show to keep its billionaire shareholder. Customers were just as split. One declared, "I'll fly Atlantic again because they dared to face their mistakes." Another was adamant, "Not a single dollar of mine will go to an airline that humiliated a black passenger." Every comment online cut into the airline like a blade. One evening, David stood on the hotel balcony overlooking Atlanta's glowing skyline. Sarah Mitchell, COO of Carter Innovations, called from New York, her voice tense. "David, you may be gambling too much. The market has no patience. If Atlantic collapses, you'll be blamed as the man who dragged the whole airline down." David was silent for a long moment, then replied, "If the truth makes them collapse, then they were never strong enough to exist. I am not here to keep them alive. I am here to make them worthy of survival." Sarah was speechless. In the quiet that followed, David's eyes drifted over the sea of city lights. He knew the real light had to come from change. On day 45, Atlantic released its reform progress report. The press swarmed the main lobby, flashbulbs firing like lightning. When Patricia Morgan stepped onto the podium, questions flew, but all circled around one thing. Was Atlantic truly changing, or was this all just performance? Then the microphone passed to David Carter. The room fell silent. He stared directly into the cameras, his voice firm and unwavering. "This is not the story of a seat. This is the story of millions who have been pushed aside. If Atlantic does not change to the very end, I will be the first to close this door. But if they change, I will be the one to open the door for the entire airline industry to turn a new page." The hall erupted in thunderous applause. Yet in the crowd, skeptical eyes still lingered. The battle was no longer between David and Atlantic. It had become a battle between hope and doubt, between reform and resistance. And the greatest question still hung in the air. Would Atlantic have the strength to see this journey through? Day 60 of the reform plan. On the surface, Atlantic Airways seemed to be running normally again. Planes taking off and landing, passengers lining up at check, in counters, glossy television ads flashing the new slogan, "Every passenger matters." But inside, a hidden war was burning fiercely. In a closed-door meeting at the Dallas branch office, a group of veteran employees gathered, whispering behind a locked door. Richard Hale, the longtime flight attendant who had publicly opposed the reforms, spoke through clenched teeth. "They're turning us into criminals because of one video. I won't take it anymore. If Carter wants to change this airline, we'll show him the price." Someone hesitated. "What do you mean? Cause chaos?" Richard smirked. "No need for chaos. Just prove his plan doesn't work. A few service incidents, a few delayed flights, and the public will turn on him." Uneasy eyes darted around, then slowly nodded. The shadow of resistance had caught flame. The next day, social media flooded with complaints, rude flight attendants, lost luggage, unexplained delays. The press pounced with biting headlines. "Where is the reform? Atlantic still the same." Patricia Morgan read the report, her chest tightening. She stormed into David's office, voice nearly breaking. "We're losing, David. It's worse than before. The stock is dropping again. The conservatives inside are sabotaging you." David sat still, his eyes steady with resolve. He had anticipated this. Deep wounds never heal overnight. They must be cut open before they can mend. But I need the board's public support. Patricia shook her head. They're divided. Half want you to stay. Half want you gone. That same day, an anonymous email spread through the company. David Carter is only using Atlantic to polish his image. He'll walk away once the market calms, and will be left with the wreckage. The message was forwarded thousands of times. Trust, already fragile, was crumbling. That night, David sat alone in his temporary office. Through the glass, Atlanta glittered, but inside him was thick darkness. He thought of his father, the factory worker who had been treated like he was invisible. He thought of the vow he made at 15. No one will ever be judged by the color of their skin or their status. And now he realized that vow was facing its greatest test. His phone buzzed. It was Sarah Mitchell, COO of Carter Innovations. David, you don't have to carry an entire airline on your back. We can pull out, protect our company, and preserve your reputation. David closed his eyes, exhaled deeply. Sarah, if I walk away now, thousands of employees will believe the Conservatives have won, and the passengers who were once dismissed will think justice is just theatre. I cannot betray them. On day 70, the board of directors convened for a decisive session. The atmosphere was suffocating, like a courtroom before a verdict. Patricia Morgan opened, her voice trembling. Today's question: will David Carter remain as reform advisor? Or do we end the partnership? Whispers swirled around the table. The Conservative faction accused David of dragging the company down. The reformists insisted he was the last hope. Then David rose. He needed no microphone. His voice carried clear, each word an arrow. You think the problem is me? But no. The problem is the toxic culture that has rotted Atlantic from within. If it is not cut out, you could replace me with 100 Carters, and the result would be the same. He paused, eyes sweeping the room. Today, I am not asking to keep this role. I am asking you. Do you want to survive for a few quarters, or do you want Atlantic to exist for decades? Silence gripped the room. Outside, thousands of employees watched via live stream. Angela Kim, the young flight attendant, whispered to a colleague, "If they fire him, I'll quit on the spot." Her words spread like fur in dry grass. A domino effect was waiting to fall. Inside, Patricia struck the gavel. The board will vote. All in favor of continuing reform with Carter. Raise your hands. One hand, then two, then three. A row of hands slowly lifted. Finally, the majority. David remained standing, his expression calm. He had won, but he knew the real battle was still ahead. The confrontation had reached its peak. The saboteurs had not laid down their arms. And David understood. For Atlantic to truly change, he would have to stake not only his name, but the very ideals he had built his life upon. Day 90 of the reform plan. Atlantic Airways' headquarters blazed with the lights of the press. Reporters crowded the grand lobby. The entire world was waiting for the answer. Had Atlantic truly changed, or had the past 3 months been nothing more than theatre? David Carter stepped out of the elevator. He wore a simple black suit, no tie, his demeanor calm, but his eyes burning bright. At his side walked Patricia Morgan and a group of executives, people who no longer dared to dismiss him as a troublesome shareholder, but now regarded him as their only savior. The great conference hall opened. On the massive screen, new numbers appeared. Service complaints down 47%. 92% of employees had voluntarily enrolled in anti-bias training. Customer trust index climbing sharply after years of decline. A murmur spread through the room, yet doubt still lingered in a few eyes. Then the doors swung open. Angela Kim, the young flight attendant who had once bravely spoken up, entered with a thick stack of documents in her arms. She walked straight to the podium, her voice trembling but steady. These are 3,000 passenger responses from the past 90 days. Many said they could feel the change. Some admitted they remain skeptical. But all agreed that Atlantic is finally listening. The room fell silent. A young employee rose to his feet, then another, and then an entire row behind them. Applause filled the air, not from the board of directors, but from the very people who kept Atlantic alive. David watched the scene and remembered the day he had been escorted off seat 2A. Then the eyes on him were prying, the phones recording his humiliation. Today, those same lenses were aimed at him, not to capture disgrace, but to witness the reversal of fate. He stepped to the podium, meeting the gaze of hundreds of eyes and the live television cameras broadcasting across the globe. 3 months ago, I was forced out of a seat I had lawfully purchased. They told me I was not worthy, but I did not stand up for myself. I stood for every passenger who had ever been disregarded, for every employee who had ever been forced into silence. He paused, then his voice rose, urgent and awful. Fairness is not a gift. It is a basic right. And if Atlantic can change, then any company can change. No more excuses, no more exceptions. Applause thundered. Cameras swept the hall, capturing faces wet with tears, capturing rare smiles after months of tension. Outside, the media rushed out breaking headlines. From humiliation to hope, Atlantic unveils reform success under David Carter's supervision. Passengers call Atlantic the new symbol of fairness in the skies. The airline's stock surged for the first time in 3 months. But more important than market value, Atlantic regained the most precious thing it had lost: trust. That evening, David left headquarters quietly. He walked down an empty street, cool wind brushing his face. A stranger ran up, grasped his hand tightly. "Thank you, sir. Because of you, my son, a young black teenager, will believe that one day he can sit in seat 2A without anyone doubting he belongs there." David smiled, saying nothing. But inside, the vow he had made at 15 years old by his father's grave echoed once more. Today, he had kept it. 6 months later, airlines around the world adopted a new global standard of passenger equity, inspired by the Atlantic Reform. People called it the Seat 2A effect. David Carter did not need his name on those standards. He simply stood in the background, watching planes lift into the sky. Skies where no passenger would ever again have to ask, "Do I deserve to sit here?" And from one man's humiliation, he had written a legacy that changed the skies themselves. In a world where prejudice still lingers, the story of David Carter reminds us that justice is not a privilege. It is a fundamental right of every human being. A single seat taken away became the spark that lit up the entire airline industry, transforming humiliation into legacy and silence, into a voice for change. If you believe that respect and fairness must always be protected, hit like to spread this message, subscribe so you do not miss the next inspiring stories, and leave a comment with just 2 words: justice, to affirm that you too stand on the side of what is right.